Thank you so much, Karthik Manoharan, for an amazing speech. I can't agree with you more when you said there should, in Tamil Nadu, there's separation of religion. I think that's necessary even in most of the developed economies like France. There's clear delineation of religion and politics. So, and you also spoke about temples. So the numbers are in Tamil Nadu, we have about 130,000 temples, in Uttar Pradesh, 250,000. But if you look at the population in UP is 3 times more, which means per capita, we have more number of temples than UP and even in Madhya Pradesh. So that way, even if you look, there's always there's always a question, how is very religious manage to vote for a government that is atheist. So the point is, people completely alienated religion from politics, and they voted DMK majorly for uplifting of the masses and for the equitable growth it was able to provide. And also, if you look, someone had written a very interesting observation saying sales tax in form of GST is a ripoff on the poor, and that is absolutely true. Even if you look at most of the leading economists, such as Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel laureate, he also said taxes like GSTs, for more so in a developing country like India, is loot, because everyone pays the same tax. Let's say if you fuel tax, someone who's making 1 crore a month and someone who's making 100 rupees, or 3,000 rupees a month, they pay the same tax. So so depending on indirect taxes directly harming the poor, and that is why we have crony capitalism that's creeping into the country. And also, if you ask what is the revenue economy, is nothing but the equitable growth model, which every leading economist from Thomas Piketty to Abhijit Banerjee to Joseph Stiglitz are saying. So that's one thing. So I think it's a very interesting question. And before going into that, I'd also ask the audience if they have any question to raise their hands. We can also include them into the panel and they can ask the question. So the question is, I think I will be open questions, so any of you can answer. Despite remarkable strides in overall growth by OBCs and the marginalized in Tamil Nadu, as compared to other states in India, caste and subcaste cleavages persist amongst us. How to overcome this hurdle? Is electoral political process promoting this predicament? It is from another. Whoever wants to answer can answer. Tirunavakar sir, do you want to go, or Karthik?
As you wish. You are the moderator, so you can choose. No problem at all. Yes, if you wish, I can add a couple of points. See, the problem with caste is that we have a very limited understanding of caste. Our understanding of caste is not like reading Dinat in the paper, or at worst reading a Tuklak columns. You understand? So caste, that's the very nature of caste. An academic work or any academician's work, if you read little carefully, the fundamental nature of caste is its, and then its ability to come back and to form a kind of an alliance. This is the inherent character of caste. So therefore, in sociology and social anthropology, so it is essentially the family that matters. That's a crux, joint family or whatever it may be. And then several families have come together to form something called a clan. And several clans have come together under certain historical conditions to form something called a subcaste. Today we call it subcaste, but those times it was the caste. Again, under certain historical conditions, several subcastes have come together to form a caste. So therefore, what is more important is, it's not something new. It has been there since the early Chola period also. So caste is breaking and then coming, and then whenever the resource crunch is there, whenever the competition is there, these kind of a coming together and going back, ayaram, gayaram type of thing is the essential, quintessential character of caste itself. So to suddenly, waking up from deep sleep saying that, oh, the slumber, oh, caste is pretty bad. Just because some Westerners have said something about caste, you don't have to necessarily buy those arguments. So what is more important is, thanks to this old man from Erode, please apply your common sense and your intelligence. Why the hell caste is here? If caste is nothing but a tyrannical structure, which is definitely, why it is surviving? Ask this simple question. That means caste has got something more than what has been explicitly argued. You understand? So they have caste as a source of exploitation. No doubt it has to be done away with. Polity called France. I don't think people have abandoned their history, but what they have done is actually they have reinvented history to such an extent that could suit culture, religion, history. All of them has to be compatible with the modern requirements. Modernity or the character of modernization are here to stay. Understand? As simple as that. I remember this fellow Mukesh Ambani a couple of years ago. His children were getting married, so he went with the invitation to all the temples across the country. He came to Rameshwaram also in a special flight. And the moment he entered, you would be rather surprised. My schoolmate, who is the Hindu Religious Endowment Board official, right? He said, "Man, I was absolutely shocked and surprised. The temple priests were falling at his feet. They've forgotten the deity." He was invited into the so-called sanctum sanctorum of the temple itself, because they knew very well the temple priest, if they say something, bloody you are a Gujarati Baniya, and top of that you are a Sindhi, you are not supposed to enter the temple. What will happen tomorrow? That will be the last sunrise they have seen in their life. So therefore, they know very well. He can create another temple somewhere else in Gujarat, in his hometown near Jamnagar, saying that this is the original Rameshwaram and that was the bogus Rameshwaram. He can create a narrative, and your 56-inch prime minister will go and inaugurate something. The entire bandwagon, all this Dol Bajaka will, stop the chorus saying that that Rameshwaram is basically Ravana's Rameshwaram. This is the original Rameshwaram. Actually, Ram had in fact appeared in my dream, and what nonsense! All the things they can do. What is important is this is the essential character of caste. So caste. So subcaste or a caste and things like that, you please, why do you have to obsess with this one? For heaven's sake, this 1.5 kg prime, thanks to this man from Europe, whom we have, at times I wonder, please remember, they call him, Tamil chauvinist, semi-national. Entire Cambridge historians were little apprehensive, or not apprehensive, very sarcastic, right? If you read some of the Cambridge historians' writing, they were very upset with the Dravidian parties. And please remember, our erstwhile Marxists have also joined the bandwagon. And they didn't have any shame to name an airport, their important places, after people like Subhash Chandra Bose. They don't have any shame. He is the man. Please remember, Subhash Chandra Bose was not an illiterate. He was an ICS officer. Waited so long to have an alliance with Hitler, and went. Hitler humiliated him, but still he went ahead. But you don't have any shame naming your airport as Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose Airport. But you have such a contempt for my old man. I don't know why. Has he gone and hugged with, smooched with Hitler or what? Third-rated fellows. I don't understand how to call these fellows. Don't have any clarity on history. But anyway. So therefore, please revisit your understanding of caste.
Yeah. Can I?
Yes,
yeah, please, Karthi.
Yeah. So following up on what Thiru sir said, just want to answer to this point whether if our electoral process is promoting this predicament. See, electoral political process has to correspond to social reality. It cannot operate in a utopian space. Like Thiru sir said, there is something I want to highlight over here, is that many of the contemporary academics who are writing about caste are living in a delusional and in a daydream world, right? So there was some really good work on caste done by the previous generation of academics, like Robert Hartgrave, Rudolph and Rudolph, right? Those were based on concrete social realities and changes that were happening on the ground. But unfortunately, now the new generation of woke caste scholars talk about what they want to be rather than on what is there on the ground. So that I don't think is good scholarship. Okay, so I'm not denying the importance of these sort of utopian visions. These are very important in changing the world, but they cannot be mistaken or confused for what is happening on the ground or what is the social reality. Okay, having said that, I think that there are two forms of ways to approach democracy. One is political democracy, another is social democracy. Now, when we are in a political democracy, we have to address the interests of all constituencies, right? So whether we like it or not, the different castes and different subcastes which exist in the state of Tamil Nadu or in the state of India for matter are constituencies. They cannot be wished away. They cannot be written away by saying that caste does not matter. So you have to any responsible politician who wants not just to win power but also to do something with power needs to talk to these sort of caste groups, caste associations, caste this thing, blah blah blah, to know what their interests are and how they can be addressed in a democratic manner, right? Now, the other aspect of it is social democracy. Social democracy is ensuring that that some of these groups or one of these groups or many of these groups don't assume a sense of supremacy over the others, right? So if you are, let's just say that X caste group has certain democratic demands, right? That they are the largest caste group in Tamil Nadu, that they do not have adequate, they feel that they do not have adequate political representation, adequate doctors, adequate engineers, blah, blah, blah. I think it is the duty of every elected politician to address that. But if this X caste group says that my caste is the direct descendants of kings, or it is the original Adi Kudi or original Purva Kudi, and therefore it is superior to all other groups in Tamil Nadu, that goes against the spirit of social democracy and will inevitably undermine political democracy as well, right? So I think that when we operate in the spirit of political democracy, the electoral parties have no other option but to address the interests of these castes and subcastes, right? But this is where Periyar is important, because Periyar's emphasis is a lot more on social democracy. So that perspective can be a sort of a moderating effect in ensuring that no one particular caste groups gets to dominate or gets to have a supremacist position over the others. So this blend of political and social democracy needs to continue. Where will that lead to? We are not astrologers, we cannot predict. But hopefully it will lead to a better society where this sort of caste differences and tensions will not matter that much.
Thank you so much, Karthi. Pukul sir, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't know anything.
Okay, so I just wanted to add one thing. See, normally people say, oh, certain communities have grown faster than the others, certain slower. But the truth is, there is no utopian world. The utopian world doesn't exist. It's a myth. Merit is also an utopian concept. 100% merit does not exist. But us policymakers, us politicians or academics, what we can try for is, under the giving limitations, how much we could maximize benefit and how much we could minimize the inequality. That's all is possible. And I think with that respect, I think we have done a great job. And I think there is a direct clarification from Shanti as directed at Karthik. So I heard about an anecdote that says Periyar suggested Ambedkar to convert to Islam instead of Buddhism. But I heard a scholar, Karthik Manoharan, mentioning it the other way. I am not sure. People who may be knowing Periyar more can explain. So what is your opinion on this?
See, this is Periyar's old position, pre-independence position. See, prior to 1947, Periyar was strongly sympathetic towards Islam, especially in the late 1920s up till, I would say, early 1940. He was very strongly advocating the subaltern communities to convert to Islam, because he believed that, converting to Islam will make you more confrontational in opposing your oppressors, this, that, and so on. But then again, Periyar also completely, not completely, he sort of was very critical of the sort of certain practices which he found were very backward in Islamic communities, right? Because, so Periyar, that Periyar travels to the Soviet Union in the early 1930s. So at that time, he also made a travel to Turkey and Egypt. And he saw that over there, the women were a lot more empowered than the women in India. So especially in Turkey, Periyar keeps making a reference to Kemal Ataturk's Turkey and says that, look, the Muslim women over there are flying aeroplanes, but you are keeping your Muslim women here behind pardas, right? So Periyar's idea of Islam was not this puritanical religious Islam, but the sort of a modernist society which was created in Ataturk's Turkey, right? So he assumed that Islam was one of the factors which led to the modernization there. That's not exactly the case, because Ataturk was, in a sense, quite secularist, and he suppressed this sort of religious articulations of politics. But having said that, what Periyar saw about Islam was that it fostered a spirit of brotherhood. It was more compatible with modernity than Hindu religion, and that it was more egalitarian. But however, Periyar also felt that it also brought about oppression of women. It also had its own set of superstitious practices and so on. And so Periyar eventually distanced himself from Islam. Like I say, Periyar, among all the religions, he was more closer to Buddhism, because he viewed Buddhism not as a religion, but as a philosophy of rationalism. That was his more consistent position. So, in fact, I would say the suggestion to convert to Islam was only a momentary suggestion. Periyar himself leaves that suggestion at a later point of time. It's only momentary.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karthik. There is one more question which I would let both of you choose, and who wants to answer can answer, or maybe even both of you can answer. There are arguments being put forth today that characterizing caste as a uniquely evil form of inequality is somehow a submission to colonialism, and true anti-colonialism involves milder treatment of caste. How would you address these arguments? And also, I have one more question. I am convinced of the answer, but I think for popular demand, normally, what do you call? Normally in public domain, average people, they have only one argument against Periyar and Dravidian movement, saying, "Oh, he opposed only Hinduism. He did not oppose other religions." So maybe if both of you could also explain that question, it will be nice. Thank you.
That is a usual.
In fact, I'm asking this question because on my article, there were 3 people who written the same thing today in Twitter right now. So I just saw it and I thought maybe this is something which everyone needs to know, and we need to keep telling it again and again. Yes, thank you.
So the European Renaissance was not, European Renaissance sometime, in the 17th century, Europe never talked about Hinduism. The entire Protestantism emerged against Catholic or papal authority, wasn't it? So it was not against Buddhism, it was not against Hinduism, it was not against Jainism. What was the reason? It's a common sense now. I mean, you don't, unless you are a staunch foot soldier of or a cheerleader of Tughlaq Cho Ramaswamy or Gurumurthy type of variety, you will not be able to ask this type of stupid question. Understand? Which is a major source of exploitation, or any source of any exploitation? Where does the justification come from? Obviously, would be the focus. Simple. As simple, and as people have correctly pointed out, roughly around 88% of population in this state are belonging to a particular religious group called the Hindus. And again, some so-called scholars have said that it is this religious tradition which is a sacred one, and that has justified everything. The notion of purity and pollution, which is the most sacred thing in the religious text, has been now converted into a social phenomena called caste. These kind of larger narratives emerged and eulogized, sanctioned, approved, and finally institutionalized during British period, will be the focus, obviously, isn't it? Will be the focus. So that is why Gandhi again and again went to none other than Narayana Guru. So is there any sanction for caste hierarchy in Hindu religion? Narayana Guru very emphatically said that no. But Gandhi, Periyar didn't even have that kind of a patience. I don't care here whether it has a or not. Those who are saying they have a sanction. Therefore, I don't believe in it. I don't believe in it. So Gandhi had to be enlightened by none other than a person who is being designated from the most subaltern community. Even his shadow was considered as polluting. He was enlightened by none other than Narayana Guru, saying that there are Smritis, there are Shrutis. Smritis may come and go. Shrutis will be the permanent philosophical things. So he was enlightened. So Gandhi was absolutely free from all those things. You understand? So, but people, I don't know why they deliberately ask this kind of probably some kind of a problem. Again and again they ask, oh, Periyar only talked about, he talked about many things, but unfortunately you don't refer to that work. Ilivu Neenga Islame Marundu, said by Periyar, none other than Periyar. There is a book, Ilivu Neenga Islame Marundu, as Karthi has correctly pointed out. And he was extremely furious when he came across ill treatment meted out to women folk within certain religious community. He was furious. He was furious. And he immediately distanced. He doesn't have to worry about anybody else because he doesn't believe in electoral politics. So he doesn't have to worry about anybody else. He said that nothing doing. Nothing doing. So his admiration for Buddhism is exactly, it is, the Buddhism was a kind of a philosophical and rational, because based on your own action matters a lot. Your birth, your ascriptive status will not determine your destiny. Your action will decide your destiny. The crux of this Buddhism is a quintessential modern one. So that is why I'm simply somewhere else in the lower echelon of the academic hierarchy. Some of the finest philosophers have already said that Buddhism is the highest form of philosophical exposition, highest form. So far, human civilizations have come out. So understand? So people have already talked about it. So that is why Periyar's proximity with the Buddhism was not because it is approving certain, rituals and things like that. It was of a different variety. Therefore, rereading of Periyar is absolutely important.
Tarani?
Sorry, I was muted. Karthik, do you want to add something? We also have 3 people.
I'm happy with this. Yeah.
Okay, so Mahalingam, Dr. Mahalingam, you can ask your question, please.
Thank you for, I want to thank both the panelists for the intellectual discussion. Actually, I really appreciate Periyar for his legacy on Tamil society. I'm also admirer of Periyar. But I have a problem. For example, when Brahmanical Hinduism was very oppressive, there were so many sects came up, among the sects, only Buddhism and Jainism survived. Okay. And also Sikhism came later. So India is land of 4 religions, major religions, which have taken its birth in India. And also various social reform movements during the colonial period, which emerged in North India. They questioned the Brahmanical domination as well as social evils like Raja Ram Mohan Roy's Brahma Samaj, Arya Samaj. These movements really have impacted. For example, in states like Punjab and Haryana, there is no Brahmanical domination. People visit Mandir, they touch the idols. But on the other hand, the Dravidian movement started by Periyar questioned the Brahmanical domination, well and good. But what is the impact? The impact, see, still I can't get into Sanctum Sanctorium. I can't touch the idol. There is Sanskritization of names. There is Sanskritization of names in Tamil Nadu. I mean, the cultural hegemony of Orients are still having grip on Tamil society. So what is the way out? I am a little confused, What, for example, Trunavukarasu has said, modernization of Tamil mind. That's what Priya suggests.
Hello. And sir, should we take one more question, or you want to just answer this, because we have three more questions to go? How do you want to do? Like, want to compile the questions together and answer, or just go ahead directly answer one by one?
Karthi, you please go ahead, Karthi.
No, there's just one question on the chat box which I would like to answer, so I'll probably do that later. So if sir, you can answer this, and I'll just do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Anyway, I don't follow. Okay, these reform movements and all, it's okay, fine. That's true. That's in any conventional textbook on Indian history, modern Indian history, will start with Arya Samaj, Brahma Samaj, and things like that. That's fair enough. You can't get into. That's what Periyar said. If your God is not respecting you, you don't have to respect the God. As simple as that. The folklore narrative of Periyar is very, very important. He didn't speak in a very flamboyant English. Understand? The language he spoke was absolutely a normal people's language. Very important. This is how you empower people. If you write in very flamboyant English, or write, for example, there's a literary movement called the one that emerged, what do you call that, little magazine variety that emerged before C.C. Solapasi. There used to be something, I didn't recollect it. A kind of too difficult, very, very classy Tamil traditions were again and again invoked. What is important is actually Periyar's language has always been directly understandable to the ordinary people. That's very, very important. That is why in many of his speeches, particularly on women's empowerment, look at the language. Remove your uterus, because men are treating you as child-bearing machines. You don't have to worry too much about men. You understand? The name Periyar was actually given by the women's conference. So therefore, these reformist movements are of a different variety. They were to a large extent, I won't say elitist, but trying to sort of justifying some of the quote-unquote sacred text. They were trying to sort of adjust or adapt themselves to the modern requirements. Two different things. Reform is something from revolution. What Periyar has initiated, your conventional political scientist may not give a term called revolution, but that is how actually Periyar's work began. It is a kind of a revolution, because revolution, first thing it says is you disapprove all that has been given to you as sacred. All that is being given to you as sacred. You have to reject. Disapproval is a very mild term. You have to reject. Then what is the value structure with which I can interact with my fellow Tamils? You create something. On what basis you have to create? You evolve. You simply evolve. That is where the notion of a very rudimentary, but I would say formidable civil society was in the making, thanks to this great man called Periyar. A form of civil society was in the making. It definitely, in the Habermasian sense, a form of civil society was in the making. That we agree to disagree, but still we can be together. As Karthi has correctly pointed out, there is a perfect bifurcation between private and public. In public, where we all agree to disagree, it doesn't matter, but still we can be together. On what point? Oh, there is a red light in the traffic, you stop here. We have an agreement. Similarly, on several points, we come to agreement on many things. When will I have an agreement with you? Unless I respect you, I will not have an agreement with you. Unless I get into a dialogue with you because I treat you as my equal, then we get into a kind of a dialogue, then we get into a consensus, value consensus, and that becomes a formidable foundation for a civil society. Private thing, you do any damn thing, we don't care. This is our. So therefore, the reform movements were not keen on these civil society making processes. That is why Periyar is quite original in his understanding. So therefore, you don't have to worry. I mean, if say simple reason, if you are not allowed to get into the sanctum sanctorum, do you actually worry? I don't think I've never come across anybody deeply upset because he was not allowed inside the sanctum sanctorum, because he knows very well. Because he's a minister. Tomorrow, for example, you can be a minister for Hindu Religious Endowment Board. Simple. Obviously, that means religion can be governed by political authority. That is another important contribution of Periyar. Please remember, all the major temples of Tamil Nadu were governed by the religious Adinams, Saiva Adinam, Madangals, all these people. Once the British took over, they took over only to loot, no doubt. But once we have inherited that colonial legacy, we have attempted, and the Dravidian movement has done it very perfectly. Very perfectly. It has to be strictly under the political administration. Today, this Jackie Veki and all these characters are saying that the temple should be governed by the, Muslims are doing it, Christians are doing it. We Hindus also should conduct our own temples, run our own temples. That's a dangerous argument. The reason actually was so-called religious groups are nothing but a kind of a mafias, because the temples have got huge land, properties. So what they want to do is actually, they were not interested. Please remember, I don't have to go back to the cliche argument. Communal rights are organized not for any religious benefits. Those who are organizing communal rights don't want to become Shankaracharya. They want to have secular power. So is the case with these kind of characters who are saying that the temple should be now administered. They are not interested in reinterpreting Bhagavad Gita or Upanishad. They were more interested in political power, because now, thanks to the Dravidian movement, temples are under political authority. Temples are under political authority. That they don't want. So I am not entering Sanctum Sanctorum. You will be facing it more brutally if it is gone out of the government's hand. And if it is gone to the so-called individual's hand, then you will understand the problem. That is where the danger comes in. So, choice is yours.
Thank you so much, sir. So next to go would be Suresh Kumar. Suresh Kumar, you can unmute and ask your question, and please keep your question brief, because we have a few more questions and we have very less time. Thank you. Suresh Kumar. If Suresh Kumar is not ready, then we can go with Dr. Daniel Swartz. Daniel Swartz, you can unmute.
Yeah, a small comment about the discussion. I think Periyar was more against the casteism than against Hinduism itself, because this narrative has been given by the contemporary fascist ideologies. I think he fought for the Hindus and the society as a whole, because regarding the caste system, I think it is more pervasive and it pervades the Christian community as a whole. I don't know about the Muslim, but there's no difference between Hindus and Muslims in the caste. The Tamil Christian community is completely casteist, at least from my point of view. I may be wrong, So Periyar was more against the caste system than the religious system. If Hinduism has not preached casteism, I don't think Periyar had any work against talking about the myths or the Hinduist religious texts. So that is one thing, and I think the success of Periyar was followed by the Dravidian parties because his ideologies were transferred into policies rather than sticking to an ideology where we read in historical books. Most of his ideas were translated into policies and laws by the successive Dravidian governments. So that's where the success of Periyar lies. And I think we have a long way to go and to bear the torch, whatever has been done, and a lot has to be done in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Next to go would be Jerome. Jerome, can you unmute and go ahead with your question?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks to Dravidian Professional Forums for starting this. Thiruvanan and Karthik, this is Jerome. I'm now in Göttingen.
I know.
Yes.
Vanakkam.
The question is, to what extent the society limits the politics of both party and social movements? Basically, victory of any candidate in a particular constituency is determined by the numerical dominance of a particular caste, and so we do see that how the voting patterns in Tamil Nadu have been towards especially the western region, where we have seen the local hegemonic interest dominate over the major political interest of the Tamils as such, and also the entire egalitarian politics. So one is this. So how the vested interests of individual communities determine the space, the political space that even parties can have. That is one. And this has limited the parties to a major way. And we also have seen how the Dravidian parties have somehow, to an extent, allowed the hegemonic spaces for the dominant groups. And we have also seen even today there is a very cautious approach by the parties when it comes to instance of violence against the Dalits or instance of honor killing and so on, where the parties are unable to openly retort, openly condemn such systematic violence. So though we say that the bifurcation between the public and private, but when it comes to caste, what is public is private. So it's like, because of the institution of marriage, it makes the personal affair is also a public affair, and so it is also a political issue. So to what extent the society and the caste system and the psyche of caste limits the possibilities for the parties and the movements? Thank you.
Karthik, please go ahead, Karthik.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jerome. Nice to hear from you, and thank you for this very important question, because it basically sums up several of the criticisms of the Dravidian movement, which I have been trying to address over my work. It's a very important that you raise it here. Let me try to bring things in brief. Yes, society limits the egalitarian politics of parties, but not just of the DMK, also of the Communist Party, also of the Congress, and also of Dalit parties like the VCK. Okay, so for instance, in the 2016 state assembly elections, right, Arundhati candidates were fielded by the DMK, ADMK, and even by the BJP, but none were fielded from the Vidudalai Sirithaigal Katchi. So this led to major criticisms from the Arundhati community that this party is not representative of all Dalits as such. Now, I recognize that these sort of questions and criticisms about representation are being made not just against the DMK, but also against the VCK, also against the Communists, also against the Congress, and several other parties. I think these are major structural problems. No one particular party, especially a party like the DMK or the CPM in Kerala or the VCK in Tamil Nadu, can be blamed for this, because, like you said, political democracy requires winning elections, and in the first past the post system, you can only field a candidate whom you are sure will get you the majority number of votes. It's really sad, but demographic does play a major role in determining which party comes to the power, and parties always calculate how to come to power based on these elections. And this is irrespective of what the party is, whether it is VCK, whether it is DMK, whether it is CPM, or whether it is Congress or BJP, they will try to field the candidate who's most likely to get them to power. So there are utopian ideas, which are one different thing, and there are political realities which parties need to take into consideration. For instance, I had this data somewhere, perhaps I can supply it to you later. There is the CPIM in Bodi Nayakanur constituency in Theni for about 11 continuous elections. They fielded the candidate from the Nayakar community, the Telugu Nayakar community. So if they are communists, why did they field candidate from a single caste? Okay. And then we can also have a look at the demographic of the VCK candidates. Have they fielded any Arundhatiyar candidates in prominent places in the past? So these sort of questions can be raised on all sort of parties. And I completely agree that society does limit the egalitarian politics of all these parties concerned. Now, this other question, do all the party members of DMK conform to the ideals of self-respect? I mean, this is a question again which can be raised at all the parties in India, right? Do all the members of Communist Party follow the ideals of Marx in their day-to-day life? Do all the members of Dalit parties follow the ideals of Dr. Ambedkar in their day-to-day lives? Forget all of these guys. Even the Hindutwadis don't follow the practices of Hindutva in their day-to-day lives. I mean, they are, I don't think we can hold parties to account on the basis of what their individuals practice or do not practice into their day-to-day life. Question is, does a party like DMK being in power enable intellectuals, the public, and general people to talk about self-respect and live, try to live a life based on self-respect or not? This is not an absolute, and there is no extreme. The question is in terms of relativity, which creates more space, which has more space for dialogues on self-respect, on democracy, on secularism, and so on and so forth. I think the answer should be clear that there are certain parties which enable the spaces for these sort of democratic dialogue more than other parties. And in that sense, I think the DMK is doing quite well. And the CPM in Kerala also. Now, and you are right to say that, that there are backward castes who claim social rights as oppressed, but they behave hegemonic and oppressive towards Dalits. But I hope you also would like to qualify that it is not all backward castes, because there are over 250 backward castes in Tamil Nadu. So the actions of 5 to 6 of these backward caste communities cannot be held as the general behavior of all the backward caste communities in Tamil Nadu, right? So for the actions of Vannars cannot be blamed. For the actions of the Maravas, Kuravars cannot be blamed. So these are highly localized sort of practices, these sort of hegemonic and oppressive sort of practices, and they need to be studied in depth with this sort of sociological precision. I think certain generalized statements which are being made about backward castes in Tamil Nadu, especially by certain interests in the academia and media, are not particularly accurate in describing social realities. Having said that, we should also take into account that there are also several cases of Devendra Kulavelalars who discriminate against those who are lower to them, of the Parayars who discriminate towards those who are lower to them. And all of these have been acknowledged and recorded by communities like Arundhatiyars, Pudurai Vannars, and so on and so forth. So this is not a tri-way competition, I would say. I don't think that we can put it very simply as Brahmin, intermediate caste, and Dalits anymore, right? So this sort of operation of caste happens at micro levels and at several levels. And I don't think any one particular group, especially the backward caste, can be held to be the beneficiaries or the greatest perpetrators of oppression. So this requires some sort of detailed study. What I'm trying to say is that in a government like the DMK, which is there today, the possibility of this sort of independent critical study and this possibility of democratic dialogue is much more than any other government. So as far as that is concerned, as academics and as intellectuals, I have a vested interest in protecting my own academic freedom and my own intellectual pursuits. And I will support those sort of regimes where I am given that sort of freedom and space. So I do think that this possibility to have this critical conversation is more under the current ruling regime in Tamil Nadu, and the possibility of reform is also more. So thank you again, and yeah, for giving me an opportunity to register some points. Yeah.
Karthik, thank you for your very detailed answer. So I think we've already crossed 2 hours. Meeting time is exceeded, but I think there's one last question. I think with this question we could end the meeting. What is it okay for one more question? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, no problem. We can take.
Okay, so yeah, the question. Yeah, sorry. The question is this. So there is a question from Mr. Cecil Sundar, which is very important and pertinent. His question is, what's the plan to educate and influence young minds with ideas and philosophies of the likes of Periyar with respect to social justice and equality, along with participation and governance? Along with this question, I will couple my question. That is, how do we prepare ourselves for 2024? How do we unify opposition parties, and how can we unify the most of the population in the theme of social justice? Thank you. Hello?
Yeah, I got your point. The thing is, yeah, I can hear you. Am I audible to you, Mr. Dharni?
Yeah, go ahead,
Yes.
please.
Yeah. See, the point is,
Please go
Dravidian
ahead.
Professional Forum, or for that matter, our initiatives, like similar initiatives, elections are important for us, but we have to go beyond elections. The fundamental point is, let us start from what is the way out, isn't it? What's the way out? I think since we have a very excellent school education minister, and we have some of the sensible bureaucrats, so therefore with which we can start with some basic things in school textbooks, school curriculum. Understand? Can you imagine for a 6th standard student, if there is a lesson, simple example I'm giving you, if there is a lesson. So the king killed his own son, and suddenly Lord Shiva appeared. If there is a lesson talks about like this, will the children be able to ask the teacher, sir, Shiva will appear in front of me? What kind of a debate or discussion you are generating in the classroom? Babu, these are the things anyway the society will teach you. Your TV serials, and many other things are there, your social media, all of them will dump you with all kinds of information. But what is more important is actually your insightful text on folk tradition is important. Your ability to ask question is more important. These are the ways, in my opinion, we can recreate Periyar and Periyar's contribution in our school textbooks, especially at the elementary level. We don't have to necessarily talk about Penny and Adimayana directly to 10th standard children. You don't have to. We can. That's fantastic. But at the very tender age, how do we do that? Our textbooks will have to be necessarily sensitive to the important lessons that Periyar has taught us. So this is where I think these are doable things. These are doable things. Please, this is how we can think. So talking about pie in the sky attitude, it's all fair enough. But what is more important is what are the doable things. So therefore, electoral politics is one thing, but the tension, what Thambi Jerome has correctly said, that it's a larger theoretical question. To what extent the society will influence politics, and to what extent polity will in turn determine the character of society. It's larger theoretical debate. Of course, we are running out of time, but it's a continuous one. It's a complementary one, at the same time contentious one. Please understand that. So therefore, please remember, at one point in time, the entire Congress party before independence was full of feudal, nasty, disgusting feudal characters, isn't it? How slowly the politics pushed things to an extent where they could have none other than Dr. Ambedkar as law minister. Please understand that. So when Dr. Ambedkar introduced the Hindu Code Bill, there are many Congress leaders, including that, what is his name? Purushottam Das Tandon type of characters, who took out a procession in Delhi saying that this Hindu Code Bill is a detrimental to Indian civilization, problematic, and all this nonsense. They said Nehru remained quiet because his government was not elected government. Ambedkar, every reason he can have to be angry with the system. He can have legitimately all anger against the system. Angrily he quit, no problem. But once he was voted back, when Congress was voted formally back to power after 51-52 election, what happened to the Purushottam Das Tandon type of characters? You can't even figure them out. Nehru is a quintessential Democrat, finished his political career, split the Hindu Code Bill into 3 bills, and made it a point that Ambedkar witnesses the passing of the bill. Right? So this is how we have to. So a very heightened political activism, a heightened social activism will have to, thanks to Dr. Ambedkar's one, political citizenship is one thing. Political democracy is one thing. Social democracy is another thing. Sometimes this dynamism is required. This dialectics is very, very required. So both are important in my opinion. So is the case with the doable things in terms of bringing in some kind of a very mythological obscurantist understandings in your school textbook. What nonsense! All this so-called caste leaders who have explicitly associated themselves as only caste leaders. You don't have to. Anyway, the society will teach them. You just go out and the society will teach them. Rather, you bring out some of the salient points of those people. You don't have to necessarily talk about their nasty rhetorics about caste pride and things like that. But where do you have it? Where do you have it? I don't understand. So these are the doable things. Slowly. Let us talk about constitutional things in our school textbook. Let us talk about children's right in our school textbook. Let us talk about some of the basic elementary aspects of some of the constitutional entitlements for all of us. Notion of equality. Let us talk about that. These are the doable things. Probably this is the best tribute we can think of towards Periyar, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your very detailed reply. I think with this, we'll come to the end of the meeting. And I would thank both of you profusely for joining us and patiently answering the questions. Thank you. And we'd also like to collaborate and cooperate with you in future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thiru. Thank you, Karthi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.